All right. So here we are with Held in the Balance, the Trask 250. If any of you have connections with Point Coupé Parish in Louisiana, if you have connections to Woodville or Wilkinson County, Mississippi, if you've got connections to Natchez or Adams County, Mississippi, if you've got ties to Concordia Parish in Louisiana, even going into other parishes like Franklin Parish or East Baton Rouge or West Feliciana, there's a huge possibility that you are connected to the information that I'm about to share with you. Huge possibility. And if your ancestors aren't directly named in the project that I've been working on, the slaveholders that were involved with your ancestors had some amount of involvement with the slaveholders that I'm going to be talking about today. All right, so for the last presentation, I was talking about my paternal grandmother. Today is Daddy's Day, apparently. His birthday is next week. My dad would have been 83 years old, but he died literally a month before I graduated from college. And this side of my tree goes back through my grandfather. I often joke about my grandfather and the fact that he was a man with aliases. In fact, it seemed like everyone on my paternal side has aliases. They were born one name and then they died something else. And so my grandfather died as Jack Oscar Sewell, but he was actually born Oswald. And that was supposed to be his name. When I first found him on the census, it was hilarious because I called my dad's first cousin and I said, hey, who is this kid Oswald? Like, I'm seeing Uncle Gus, her father, I'm seeing Aunt Nora, I'm seeing everybody else. And she said, girl, that's your granddaddy. And I said, excuse me? We've never referred to this man as Oswald. And she said, well, you know, one day we were all at the house and some man came around looking for your granddaddy, talking about he was looking for Jack. And from that day on, he started going by Jack. If that's not one of those just kind of country stories, but this was in Chicago. So I guess it was just, I don't know, it was as an import story. But my grandfather was born Oswald. And then when I had his delayed birth certificate, it was really a notarized statement of his birth that listed Jack Oscar Sewell. But I actually found his original birth certificate in New Orleans. And I think the reason why he had to get that signed affidavit was because the midwife recorded his name wrong. She had his name as Osborne. So the man went from Osborne Oswald, but supposed to be was named Osborne on the birth certificate. Then he went by Jack Oscar. And then when I found his draft card, it was Jack John. So yes, that is so apropos for him as a person. So we're going to go through his father, who was named James Benjamin Sewell. We called him Honey, and so you'll hear me refer to Honey for the rest of this presentation, but just know that Honey and James B. Sewell are the same person. James B. Sewell and his wife, Teresa, actually raised my father. So my father and all of his first cousins were raised by their grandparents pretty much their entire lives or until they got into high school. So I had, some great intel on my great-grandparents on that side of the family. So what we're looking at right now is the New Orleans 1900 census in the 14th ward. And I'm going to pull out this particular piece or slice of the pie. I don't know for you all if your folks are always on the bottom of the page, but for some reason, my folks always end up on the bottom of the page. And so you'll see at the bottom in yellow is James Sewell. And that's my grandfather, great-grandfather. And he is a 12-year-old little boy with a birth location of Louisiana, his father born in Louisiana, and his mother born in Mississippi. And it says that he's at school. And he's listed as a grandchild to the head of household, who is a man named Smith Reeder. And he has a wife named Letty Reeder. And then there are some pictures of those two. Smith Reeder ended up dying in 1903. He fell through the neutral ground or through the, if you have New Orleanian roots, you know about the drainage that is in the streets. And at that time, it was very archaic and they were like these gaping holes in the ground in order to make sure the city, stayed afloat so to speak. And so it was dark outside and he was walking and he fell into one of those drainage ditches and died and had like a compound fracture. So that's how Smith Reeder died. And then Letty, his wife, maiden name Fountain, she died a year prior, and it was all in New Orleans. If you notice, Letty has given birth to 10 children, but only 3 of them are living. Also in the household is allegedly a daughter of Smith and Letty Reeder named Celia Reeder. And then there's also another granddaughter named Nora, or Elnora Spears, who was in the household. And so there's a picture of Nora. She didn't die until 1981. She lived to be almost 100 years old. And there's a picture of James B. Sewell, or Honey. Believe it or not, right before the pandemic really got in a full swing this year, I was supposed to meet with a cousin of mine through Nora who has all of these pictures. And my trip got cut short. And I was literally sitting in the airport in San Francisco International Airport. And my cousin said, I really want to make sure you at least get these photos, at least, let me take pictures of them. And I was in the airport bawling, crying, because I had never seen a picture of my great grandfather. And that trip and seeing that picture almost got derailed by the pandemic because I had to come right back home. Had a speaking engagement in Sacramento. And so this picture that you're seeing of Honey, that's the first picture I ever saw of him, even though I had been researching his family for a number of years. So here's the thing. Most people looking at this census would say, oh, this is a blessing because you've got 2 grandchildren living with their grandparents. So you're back a generation. Well, not actually. That's not actually a blessing in some instances, because you notice the parents for these 2 children, there's 2 different last names, right? So you can assume that these 2 grandchildren come from the same child of the grandparents, right? They could come from one child and another, especially since there's 2 different last names at work here, right? So we don't know that. So who's the mother or father of these 2 kids, right? Neither one of them have the last name Reeder. It's 3 different surnames that are here, right? And so for the longest time, I had no other leads. All I knew was I knew this was my great grandfather, knew it, because I knew he lived in New Orleans. And, when the 1910 census came, he married my great grandmother. We call her Nanny. He married Nanny. They were all there together. And then I found my grandfather and them on the 1920. And then by 1930, they had moved to Chicago. Like, I had all of that was done solid. But I had no idea who his parents were, like nothing. I knew who the grandparents were, but I did not know who his parents were, right? And so then as the World War II draft cards become available, I pull Honey's draft card. And notice it lists he's living at 4902 South Michigan in Chicago on the south side, but his place of birth is noted as Vidalia, Louisiana. Now, that is not New Orleans, right? Which is where I found him in 1900. Vidalia is in the north. It's in Concordia Parish. And so I said, oh, wow. Okay. So I know this is Honey because the name and address of the person who will always know where you live is Nanny, is Teresa, his wife, right? And I know that it's him because he worked for Metropolitan Funeral Services. He used to sell funeral insurance. So I knew that this was him. So I started looking in Vidalia. I said, okay, he's born in 1887. So if someone would say, oh, well, you could just go to the 1880 census. No, he was born in 1887. So I didn't have 1890 to go on, right? And so I had to work around this, right? There are so many of us that have the same exact scenario, right? Where you have an ancestor that was born right around the 1890 census. And because we don't have that, you have to use every workaround to try and get to more information. And so there were no good leads on his mom. Remember, I didn't have anything, right? I just knew he was born in Vidalia. I went on a hunch and found a man named Benjamin James Sewell, the reverse of his first and middle name, and saw that he had family members and all that. And so I said, you know what? This is the only lead I have on a dad. So maybe this is his father. That did bear out. The descendants of Benjamin's siblings are sharing DNA with us. So that was a great guess. But his mother, still nothing. I knew his grandmother was Letty, but I didn't know who his mother was. So this is when the story of a train ride comes into play. My dad has a first cousin named Ramona. And remember, as I mentioned to you, my great grandparents raised my dad and his first cousins. They raised my father, my aunt Gail. They raised my dad's first cousins, Ramona and Marion, who were sisters. They raised their other grandchild, or my dad's first cousin, Jerry. All of them all lived in the same house together. And so Ramona, I don't know if you all raise your hands or use the chat room if you have a family member that literally can remember like every single day of their lives, every single day of their lives, right? Like who can just recall details like, yeah, so back on, June 1st, in 1965, I had a bowl of cornflakes and I was drinking my coffee when. Ramona is one of those people. And she told me a story about when her and my father got on a train and they went to Oakland, California. And I'm sitting here thinking, okay, daddy was from Chicago. He lived in, he lived in Chicago, and then they moved to California. Like those are, and my dad went to college at Clark Atlanta. So those are the only three places I know my father ever lived. And really, I know he traveled, but he went to Oakland. And at the time, I was living in the Bay Area. And so she said, yeah, we got on a train and we went cross country because Honey's mother was dying. Now, remember, I told you I didn't know her name. And I said, well, what was her name, Ramona? And she said, I don't remember her name, but we got on a train because Aunt Nora, remember the name of the other grandchild on the census? That was his sister? Aunt Nora called and said that their mother was dying and he needed to come and see her. And so I said, well, how old were you all when this happened? And she said, it was around 1946. And she said, I remember we got on the train and Ramona was the exact same age as my father. They were born the exact same year, a month apart. Marion and my aunt were born the exact same year, a month apart. And so Ramona said she remembered on this train ride that they were playing with this little white boy and they were having so much fun. And when they were playing with the little boy, one of his parents came and took him away. And how when she was a child, that was one of the first times she really remembered racism and how it happened on this train ride. And so then she mentioned when they got to Oakland, they went to Aunt Nora's house. She told me the address, you all. Remember, she was a kid in 1946, okay? She was 8 or 9 years old, and she remembered her aunt's address. And she said, when we got to Aunt Nora's house, she had sons there, and there was one named Maury. And we loved him. We spent so much time with him. And then Honey and Aunt Nora, they went away to go see their mom. And we stayed at the house with Maury. You should look him up. And I said, really? She said, I bet you they still have the house. It's on Dorr Street in Berkeley. And she gave me the exact address. And when I looked up that house and I looked up Maury, this is what I discovered. If you remember a cartoon strip called We Pals, it was the first syndicated minority cartoon strip in the country. And the artist behind it was a man named Maury Turner. And Maury Turner was Aunt Nora's son. And he lived right there by me in the Bay Area, and I had no idea. The artist, the clipping that you see to the left is from Ebony Magazine, and it's from February 1973, and there was an entire profile, several profiles that were written on Maury, and he's speaking to some students in Oakland, and then when he passed away in 2014, there was a New York Times obituary for him. And I tracked him down and I called the house. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, he's probably not gonna know who the heck I am, because at that point I wasn't married yet, so I still had the last name Sewell. So I call and he's got a caller ID. And I said, hi, can I speak to Maury Turner? And he said, yes, this is me. And if you ever heard him talk, that's really how he sounds. I miss him so much. And I said, hi, so I'm a cousin of yours. He says, I know. You come from Uncle Suge. And I said, I'm thinking, how does this man know who I am already? He said, yeah, Uncle Suge, that's his last name was Sewell. They called my great grandfather Sugar. We called him Honey. Both sweet things, but they called him Uncle Suge. And so he started rattling off all of these things about Uncle Suge and my grandfather and all the other cousins. And so he was my great grandfather was his uncle. Honey was Maury's uncle. And what Maury told me was that when Ramona and them came out on the train, he remembered that. He even knew my father's name. He knew Ramona's name, and everybody's name. He said, yeah, they came out because grandma was dying. And I said, what is her name? And he said, I can't remember her name. And I'm thinking, nobody remembers this woman's name. What is her name? And he said, you know what? Go to the cemetery. Go to Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland and find mama and daddy's graves. And you find Nora, my mom's grave, and you find my father's grave right next to that. And then you're going to find her grave. Grandma's grave was right next to theirs. And so I went to the cemetery that I literally passed by every single day for me to go to work. And 2 folks over from Aunt Nora was Easter. No one remembered her name. One thing I forgot to mention about Maury is that We Pals actually became an animated series. And you can even catch episodes on YouTube. And he and Maury drew his comic strip all the way up until he died. It's still in syndication. You can still go online and read it today. And so Easter was her name. And she was buried there in Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland. And I had no idea that my great-grandmother had died literally in the area that I was living in. I was born and raised in Southern California, and I went to the Bay Area for college, and I lived there for more than half of my life. And this woman's grave was there, and she died in 1946, just like Ramona told me, which is why they went out there to visit. And so as a result of that, you're looking at a picture of Aunt Nora right there in the center, and Easter. It was a 5-year journey to get to her, to even get to her name. And the thing that was hilarious is I was trying to figure it out on my own with just that census, right? Like I could go back and find her, I could do it. And it took me calling some folks. Come on now, y'all. Remember, I mentioned to you that you can't do this by yourself. You need a team. You need somebody that you can call and bounce ideas off of, or family members that you can get oral history from. You can't operate in a vacuum, because had I done that, I would not know any of this information. And some of you may be shy. Some of you may not, be the most outgoing people, but not reaching out to people can really put some interesting and unique challenges on your research that you may not be able to overcome. And so once I really started reaching out, that's when it just expanded exponentially. So because I knew that Easter died in the state of California, I wrote to the state to get her death certificate. And look right there, the address that Ramona gave me, 2761 Dorr Street, is where she was living in Berkeley, California. Ramona remembered that address from being an 8-year-old child. And so I proceeded to scan the document. What was the information that was there, right? Notice it says that she was living at Agnew State Hospital, which was the state mental hospital. And it was because they went to go and get her from Natchez, Mississippi. Maury told me that he remembered them driving from California to go and get his grandmother. And that once she got to California, they noticed that she was suffering from dementia, and they would keep her at the house, but she started wandering off, and they got worried about her. Uncle George, who was Aunt Nora's husband, was a Pullman porter and was super active in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters with people like A. Philip Randolph in Oakland. And he worked at 6th Street Station. And Aunt Nora was a domestic. And she graduated from Fisk University with a degree in domestic science. And so they had children, they had a family, and they could not watch her. And so they ended up sending her to Agnew State Hospital. Now, the information that I wanted to know was who her parents were. And if you notice, her mother is listed as Letty Fountain. Remember, on the 1900 census, she's listed as the grandmother of my great-grandfather, Honey. So I knew that Letty was Easter's mom, right? Great. But the father was not Smith Reeder. It was some other man named Daniel Parker, right? Note that we don't have a known birth location for Daniel Parker, but Letty is being listed as being born in Mississippi. Okay. The other thing that's listed is that her husband has the last name Williams. Notice, y'all, how many dang surnames are just in this one family. Amasul on Nora's a Spears. Letty was a Fountain. Then Easter's daddy was supposed to be a Parker. And then she married a Williams. If you aren't organized with your family history and mapping all of these relationships out, not just your direct lines, right? Because see, if I was solely focused on my branch of the family, I would not have reached out to Maury, right? I would have only just mapped Honey's side. But because I knew that I couldn't do this research and just focus on just my folks, I knew these relationships and all the surnames that were involved, I could follow and I could track them, okay? So if we've got Easter here, born 1856, 1857, I've discovered later in Wilkinson County, Mississippi. She died in Santa Clara County, California in 1946. Her parents were supposed to be Daniel Parker and Letty Fountain. Her first relationship is with a man named Anthony Spears, and that is Aunt Nora's father. So Nora Spears Turner was born in Concordia Parish, Louisiana. Now, if you know anything about geography, Concordia Parish is directly west of Wilkinson County, Mississippi. It's right next to it, okay? And then Aunt Nora lived until 1981. She was 98 years old or so, 97 years old when she passed away. Then Easter has a relationship with Benjamin James Sewell, which is how my great-grandfather Honey came to be. He was born in 1887, Concordia Parish, dies in 1951 in Chicago. Then Easter has a relationship with a man named Samuel Williams, and she has 3 children by him, Alphonse, Uncle Amos, and Alfred. And Amos's descendants, I discovered them, found them, right? We're all connected, DNA, everything maps out. But notice the number of surnames with just this one immediate family, right? We've got Parker, Fountain, Spears, Sewell, and Williams. There are 5. So if you're not organized, and you don't know who belongs to who and how, you are going to be all over the place. And those of you who are part of my Patreon community know I'm constantly talking about this with regard to enslavement, because remember, slavery was passed down. The disposition of the child, the enslaved child, was determined by the disposition of their mother. So if you don't have all the surnames involved, you might not get back as far as you want to. So using that information that I had, I decided to search in Concordia Parish for Letty and Easter. And I found a good lead. I found and notice this census taker, I just want to punch him in the jaw. Because instead of them saying the relationship to the head of household, instead of them saying head and then wife and daughter and son, they did stuff like father, daughter, aunt. Really, that's not helping me. And I found a good lead on who I thought was Smith Reeder. Remember, that was the husband that Letty had on the 1900 census, and he's listed with 2 other daughters there. And then right next door to him is a 45-year-old Letty and an Esther. Now, if you recall, Easter and Esther get interchanged all the time. And notice it says Letty Fountain or Fountum, okay, with the birth location of Mississippi, which matches what was on the 1900 census, right? And the same thing for what was on the 1900 census for Honey, for his mother's birth location of Louisiana. So I was pretty sure that this was them. Also, considering that Aunt Nora was supposed to be born in Concordia Parish and Honey, right? And then Uncle Alphonse as well. It was making sense that this was probably them in 1880. Remember, we don't have a 1890 to refer to for this. So this is all I had. I just had to go on my hunch. And sometimes with your research, you have to do that in order for you to vet that that route is either right or wrong. And you have to do it knowing full well that you might have to go back and start all over again. But you don't know if it's going to be successful or not unless you try, right? So then I tried to go back to the 1870 census, and I found who appears to maybe be Letty and Easter, but it's listed under Parker. It's not under Fountain, right? Now, remember, Easter's death certificate said her father's name was Parker. So it could be that they would be under Parker, but could they be under Fountain? Because on 1880, they were under Fountain, but then Easter's death certificate said that her mother was a Fountain maiden name and her father was a Parker. I don't know, right? And so I looked for them in Concordia Parish. I didn't find them there at all. Right. But I found these people in the county next to where they were from or where they were living in 1880. I found some folks there that really, it was a good possibility that it could be them, but I just wasn't sure. But how could I prove that I had the right people? Right? How could I prove? So here's a map just for context, right? We've got Black Hawk, which is where they were living in on the 1880 US Census. It's right there. It's on the Mississippi Delta, right? And then the potential 1870 location is right next to that, just off the river, right? In Wilkinson County, Mississippi. That's how close these locations were, right? And so, you know, it's funny because there is no bridge right there. So you can't just like walk over. But back then, people used to literally walk over. When the water was low in the river, they would either take a boat or sometimes, depending on the time of the year, you could get over there with a barge or a ferry or any of that other kind of stuff. Now you've got to drive through Natchez to come and go down to Wilkinson County from Concordia Parish, or from Vidalia, Black Hawk, all those areas, right? So this is the proximity we're dealing with this. So here's where DNA comes in, right? And this is where the roots of the Trask 250 begin to solidify and take off. So here's the thing. I know that Letty is my third great grandmother, right? And I know that her daughter is Easter. And I also know that Easter had 3 different relationships. She had Aunt Nora with Anthony Spears, Maury, who was my cousin, the cartoonist, he comes from Nora, and that Maury's son and his grandson have tested. Anyone that you see on this chart that's green has done a DNA test. So I had Maury's son and I had Maury's grandson as people who have DNA tested, and their direct relationships to me are half second cousin once removed. Remember, we talked about that recently, the last presentation, right? Maury's son and my father are half second cousins, but Maury's son to me is a half second cousin once removed. They're half because remember, Easter's children have different fathers, so it's half relationships. So in addition to that, we also have folks that descend from my great-grandfather, Honey, through my grandfather, remember, Osborne, Oswald, Jack O, right? Me. Then you see my Uncle Gus. I have RM, who's my cousin Ramona, who I told you that remembers every day of her life. I've tested her. Her daughter has tested. We also have more cousins who have tested as a result of my Aunt Nora. Notice the names are repeated several times, right? We also have cousins that also come from Uncle Gus as well. So at this point, between the first sets of kids that Easter has, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people tested, right? Then we move to Uncle Amos, and he has 2 descendants who have tested. Now, some of you who are maybe new to genealogy and genetic genealogy may be wondering why are half relationships in some ways better than full relationships with genetic testing? For those of you who know the answer to this, why is that? Why would a half relationship between descendants in some ways be better than having a full relationship? Use the chat room. Remember, at this point, I had both Easter and Letty's names. I also had my great-grandfather living with Letty in 1900, but I wasn't sure the folks I found in 1870 were my Letty and Easter. The other thing is I didn't have any DNA matches that connected to Smith Reeder, Letty's husband, and I didn't have any DNA matches that went to Daniel Parker, who was supposed to be Easter's father. So at this point, I only could deal with the women. That was the only solid information that I have. So how could I verify these folks in Wilkinson County were my folks and exactly who the father of Easter was, right? And so this is exactly, it's because of potential DNA connection through the mother. There you go. You can tell what side of the family the relationship is. You can only focus on the line you have in common. There you go. Process of elimination. Because all these people in green are only connected through these women, they're only connected through Easter. Anyone that we all have in common as a DNA match has to come through her. it can't come through the daddies because the daddies are different. So that meant that I could direct my research on through any matches I had in common with any of these folks, and that some of those matches were going to be through Easter, right? For the folks that come from my great-grandfather, I have to factor in that he was married, right? So some of our matches could come from my great-grandmother. But the matches that me and my closely related family had with descendants of Aunt Nora and Uncle Amos, those folks that we all had in common with their descendants had to come, the relationships had to come from Easter, okay? Had to. So that meant I could literally chop off a huge chunk of my tree as being the source of the connection between me and other people because of those half relationships. So I highly suggest that if you have this scenario where you have an ancestor, whether male or female, who has multiple kids by multiple people, to test those descendants, because it will help you direct your research only through one line of the family instead of two lines of the family. So here's what happened. As a result of me looking through DNA matches, I had DNA matches that were in Concordia Parish, which is where I found them in 1880. I had DNA matches that were also in the location of the potential record I found for them in 1870. And then a third location emerged down further south in Louisiana in a place called New Roads or Ventress in Point Coupé Parish, Louisiana. What I did was I took inventory of our shared matches. I knew that our shared matches were connected to all of us through Easter and Easter only. So then I mapped out the locations. With genetic genealogy, what you want to do is you want to look at patterns in surnames, patterns in genealogies or pedigrees, and patterns in locations. You want to find out what's the repetition, right? I'm seeing a bunch of folks from Concordia Parish. I'm seeing a bunch of folks from Wilkinson County. I'm seeing a bunch of folks from Point Coupé. And I then took that as a lead, right? And so this is where you track ancestral locations of your triangulated matches, right? Of your matches in common to unearth ties to slavery. This is how you do this. So I went back out of frustration because I was really looking for this smoking gun to make sure that this 1870 was correct. I went back to this 1880 US Census, and not finding the connection between the three locations, I just went back and I said, okay, I know these are the right people, right? And how many of you, raise your hand if you had a conundrum like this and you just keep going back to the same record because you are hoping that maybe there's something you missed the last time that you just didn't see. Yes, yes, yes. I love all those hands. Yes, keep going back. Keep going back, y'all. Keep going back, because this is going to prove to you why. So remember, Easter's death certificate said that her mother's maiden name was Fountain, okay? We found a Letty Fountain on the 1880 census living in Concordia Parish. In her household is a daughter named Esther or Easter. We see that they are next door to who would become Letty's husband, Smith Reeder. His occupation matches. He was a carpenter in 1900. He's a carpenter in 1880, right? And so because I was frustrated, I went back to this record. There's got to be something on here that I'm missing, right? I don't have anything to lose. You know, let me look at the community, right? Because let me look. There are fountains on the same page as them. Same surname. Households right next to them. You see them here in green, right? They're living close by. Are they related to Letty or Easter? Right? Are they a part of an enslaved community? What is it, right? And so I started with Henderson Fountain and his wife, Patsy, who are at the top, right? And then I was also looking at the household next door to Taylor Hayes and Patience Hayes, right? Sometimes when you are doing research and you're trying to find your family and you can't find them on a census, what you can do is you can use the census that you did find your family on and then look for neighbors around them on the previous census to see if your family's names were maybe misspelled or if they were going by different surname or what, right? And so I figured, well, you know what? Let me completely, let me go ahead and completely just try to find these fountains in 1870, right? Because then I can really say, okay, maybe they went by, maybe it was their last name was butchered on 1870, and that's not why I'm not finding them. Let me see that the neighborhood is exactly the same. Additionally, there's an Anna Fountain, a 12-year-old Anna Fountain that's listed in the same household as Smith Reeder, right? And she's listed as a servant. And so I said, okay, Let me see where these people are in 1870. What I discovered is Henderson Fountain in a household of a man named Isaac Fountain, who was age 55 in 1870. He was married to a woman named Delphine or Delphine Fountain. You also see that they have other children named Anthony and Anne. Remember, I just said there was an Anne Fountain that was literally listed in the household as Smith Reeder, who we know is Letty's husband by 1900, right? When they are living in New Orleans. Next door to Isaac Fountain and his wife Delphine and Henderson, remember I found Henderson in 1880, is Taylor Hayes and his wife Patience. Their daughter Clara or Clorinda was also on that 1880 census. But when I looked around the neighborhood, I didn't find Letty and I didn't find Easter. So this further kind of solidified for me that, okay, well, maybe those folks that I found on that 1870 census in Wilkinson County, maybe those are my people, right? We also have DNA matches that come from there, right? So let me dig a little bit further into Isaac and Delphine, because I didn't find them on the census in 1880. And when I did that, that is when the door flew open. I discovered a labor contract with a man named A.T. Welch in Black Hawk, same area my family was living in, right, in 1880, right, that we had DNA matches going back to. I found an 67 labor contract with an A.T. Welch for a plantation called Cutoff in Concordia Parish. And on line number 38 is Isaac Fountain, and it lists him and himself and his family. Next under that is Delphi Fountain, Patience Fountain, and Henderson Fountain. Now remember, on 1880, there was a Taylor Hayes and his wife, Patience Hayes. On 1870, there was a Taylor Hayes and a Patience Hayes living next door to Isaac and Delphine. And then 3 years prior to that 1870 census, here's a labor contract with a Isaac, a Delphine, a Patience Fountain, and a Henderson Fountain. Now, Brandon, these are some, we talking some interesting names, right? Because Easter could have been, she was listed as Easter Fountain and a Patience Fountain, right? Right, but we're gonna honor them, right? And so I said, okay, I know that A.T. Welch is the administrator over this labor contract. So if I'm going to potentially research him as a slaveholder, now, if you all are not familiar with labor contracts, they were part of the Freedmen's Bureau, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And that was an entity created by Congress to basically stabilize the country during Reconstruction. They would do they would have agents all across the country in former slaveholding states where they had field offices who would oversee these labor contracts between former slaveholders and their formerly enslaved, to make sure that the formerly enslaved were being properly compensated for their work as newly freed people. And so what you're seeing in this extract of that, this is a huge page that I have really kind of cropped down so you guys can see the detail. It lists the names, the ages, the sexes, the class of worker. It also lists the number of persons dependent on the laborers for support, the rate of wages, interest and profits, and remarks, right? And so for Delphi, it says to work regular, right? Rate as expected, because she was considered a second class worker, and Henderson was considered a fourth class worker, right? So his pay wasn't as high as Isaac. Isaac was listed as a first class worker and was getting a rate of $15, okay? And so here's the thing. If you find a labor contract, and you can find these on Family Search, they have been indexed by Family Search, but I'll give you one word of caution. In the indexing on Family Search, 99.9% of the time, the location that they say that the labor contract was in the index, when you type in the names to search, is incorrect. If you go to pull up this labor contract, if you literally put in Isaac Fountain and you search for a labor contract, it's going to say the contract took place in New Orleans, which is wrong. The contract took place in Concordia Parish. It's just that I think they did a blanket change to all the locations, and they put, if the contract was in Louisiana, they made all of the locations defaulted to New Orleans, and that's not true. You need to go into each individual image for folks of interest and actually read the contract to see where it is. And that by and large is across the country, okay? So I'll issue you that word of caution. Still love the index, but the locations listed in the index are wrong. So I decided to look at A.T. Welch. And here's the thing. If you are researching formerly enslaved people, as much as we want to divorce ourselves from those slave-holding families, we do not have a choice. You have to research the enslaving family like it is your own family. You have to know these folks better than some of their descendants do. Can I get an amen? Because where they were are where your folks were. And I knew that if A.T. Welch was alive in 1867 to have a labor contract, I knew that I could not search him down for a probate or a succession to get a will or an inventory because he lived after slavery ended. So that meant I had to map out his family tree to find out who did die before the war and who did have a probate and a succession that mentions the names of the formerly enslaved. Okay? So he was out of contention, right? I can still look for his records, but I'd have to go through deeds. How would I know which one is the right one? So I had to map out his family tree. And I had to literally cancel out the majority of the people in his generation because they all died after slavery ended. Some of you who are watching this are like, oh my God, all those folks on his generation died after slavery. Oh man, that means there's no inventory and no will, right? Edward Pinchon, his first cousin, died in 1868. James Pinchon, his first cousin, died in 1878. James Ventris, who was married to his first cousin, Charlotte, died in 1867. And then Charlotte died in 1877. And then Augustus himself died in 1868. His wife, Sarah, died in 1895. So that meant that generation was basically canceled, with the exception of maybe pulling out deeds that may list the names of the enslaved. That meant I had to go a generation up, really two. And when I mapped that out, I had several candidates of family members who could have bequeathed property to Augustus Welch or A.T. Welch, including his uncle Israel Elliott Trask, his uncle Stephen Pinchon, who was married to his aunt Sarah Trask, his uncle James Trask, his uncle Augustus Trask, his parents, Emily Trask and Bella Welch, right? Even his grandparents, Israel Trask and Sarah Lawrence. What I discovered is that this generation that was ahead of him, they were all from Massachusetts. They weren't even from Louisiana or Mississippi. And the first person that I chose to look at was James L. Trask. Before I even went deep into any of these other folks that are in green, I chose James L. Trask, and my life has not been the same since I did that. Why? Because James L. Trask is sort of the brains and operation behind all of this. James L. Trask died in 1855. And I pulled his estate inventory. And y'all tell me whose names you see on this estate inventory. Remember, these Trasks lived in Mississippi, but they were by way of Western Massachusetts. Those sons that you saw on this slide here, they all migrated from Massachusetts down to Louisiana and Mississippi and became slaveholders, while a portion of their family remained in Massachusetts. They came and made their money off of enslaved people, right? This whole family is all intertwined into the North. And if you look at this inventory that's in Wilkinson County, remember, that's where I thought I had found Letty and Easter in 1870. Remember, I wasn't sure if it was the right people, but who did I find on this inventory across the river where they're living, where I'm thinking that Easter and Letty are living in 1870, but Isaac, Delpha, Nathan, Amos, Patience, and Henderson. Oh, is it a fluke? Could it be the same people? Well, I've got to rule in or out, right? That it's right. Let me do a comparison between the 1855 inventory and the 1870 census. Doesn't that look a lot like the exact same names, right? We're missing Henderson at the very top as the oldest child, right? We've got Annie instead of Anthony, right? We've got Nace instead of Nathan, right? Which are probably additional folks, right? These are probably grandchildren by this point, because there's a whole 15 years that exists between this inventory and this 1870 census, right? We've got Patience, who was listed with her husband, right? So, okay, let me do further vetting. Let me make sure that this is correct. I'll go over to the next page on the same inventory. Who do I find but Randall? And look at this. Old Randall is listed as with a value of $1. $1. And it's because he was old. And the laws and the customs at the time said that you just couldn't just leave an enslaved person because they couldn't work for you. You had to care for them until they died. And then there's another Randall listed at $1,250. And then a Letty listed under there and a Caroline, right? Let me take you back to the 1870 census. Notice who is next door to my Letty is a Caroline who was age 63 and a Randall who was age 17, roughly. Notice that there is an Esther in the household with Caroline. Then we've got who I believe is my Letty, another Caroline. Notice the naming patterns that are repeated over and over and over and over again, right? But here's the question. I had that 1855 inventory. Letty was, Easter was born around that same time. So why is she not on that inventory? Shouldn't she be on the inventory with her mom? Was Letty pregnant? What do we know, right? So I got this huge lead. So at this point I decide, let me go back to my DNA matches. Let me look at these folks that are in Point Coupé, right? Because I had matches in Concordia Parish and I had matches in Wilkinson County, Mississippi, and then I had matches in Point Coupé. And all of the matches that were in Point Coupé were descendants of a man named Sago Haynes. He was born between 1831 and 1835, right? And so I'm thinking, remember, I've already searched matches for Smith Reader. I've already searched my matches and my family's matches for Daniel Parker too. There are no smoking guns back to these people. But for my family, all of the folks that are Easter's descendants are matching these folks who are descendants of Sago Haynes. So wait a minute, could it be that Sago was actually the daddy? Well, if Sago's the dad and Easter's born around 1855, 1857-ish, I should be able to find this Sago Haynes on the same estate documents that I found Letty and Isaac and Delphine and Patience and Henderson. I should be able to find all of them on the same stuff, right? Oh, look at that. When James Trask died in 1855, he gave an entire plantation and enslaved people to his niece, Charlotte Pynchon Ventress. She got all of that land and those enslaved people to herself. And some of the names listed on that transaction, remember, this is a separate deed from his estate stuff that happened later the same month in 1855, right? And so it lists Jim, age 40, Maida, age 38, Sago, age 20, putting his birth around 1835, the same as the records I had found that his descendants had found, along with Alfred, age 15, Sterling, age 11, Fatima, age 13, and Zacharina, age 8. But there was no Easter on this record either. So remember, I had an inventory, I had a will, those enslaved who were on the will were on the inventory. Then I had a separate deed at the beginning of the month when James Trask died, where Sago and them are mentioned on this deed. Then I find that Augustus got his plantation and enslaved people to himself a whole year before James Trask died, which pulled in another deed, right? So where is Easter? We found Letty, we found Sago. Sago and Letty are around the same age. They're at the same place at the same time, right? The DNA is going back to Sago Haynes. Where is Easter? In 1856, Charlotte Ventress and Augustus Trask Welch have a quitclaim deed between themselves. As you recall, I just mentioned, Augustus got his implantation and enslaved people in 1854, a year before his uncle died. The same month that the uncle died, he bequeathed a plantation and enslaved people to his daughter, or to his, really she's his adopted daughter, but she's his niece, Charlotte Ventris. So she got her own plantation and slaves to herself. Then in his will, which included the names of Isaac, Delphine, Patience, and Henderson, and the Fountains and Letty, those enslaved in that plantation was divided between A.T. Welch and Charlotte Ventris. And in order for them to operate independently, they separated the enslaved people between them. And Easter went to Charlotte. Actually, Easter, yeah, that's exactly how it went. Easter went to Charlotte, or went to Augustus Welch, and Letty went to Charlotte. The transaction was on Christmas Day of 1856. You notice at the top where it's highlighted, it says Easter infant. On Christmas Day of 1856, Easter infant was quick claimed from Augustus Welch to Charlotte Ventris away from her mother Letty, and Letty was quick claimed from Charlotte Ventris over to A.T. Welch. At the time, A.T. Welch lived in Concordia Parish, Louisiana, while Charlotte Ventris lived in Wilkinson County, Mississippi. This meant that Letty and Easter were separated. Sago Haynes and his family were later relocated by Charlotte Ventris to Point Coupé Parish, Louisiana. That is why our DNA matches through Easter were in 3 different locations, is because of slavery. So if you have a scenario where you've got matches from 3 far-flung places, or maybe they're remotely close, the reason why is most likely because of slavery. So this was them. My guess was right. Letty and Easter were right there, and they were in Wilkinson County because Letty went to get her baby. They had been reunited after being sold apart within the same slave-holding family. That's exactly what happened. And as a result of the research, right, this is all the same, but what it does is it changes at the previous generation. It's no longer Daniel Parker, because you got to remember who provided the information for that death certificate. They were descendants of the folks, right? They were 2 or 3 generations later. They weren't there in 1856 to know that Easter was deeded away from her mother. All they had to go on is what they heard or what they thought they remembered. And Aunt Nora and Honey and whoever else used the best of their knowledge to fill out that death certificate. But as I always say, and as my good friend Vernesta Sheila says, we weren't down there shining a light when the deed happened. So we don't know until we DNA and we paper trail who the fathers are. But the DNA goes back to Sago Haynes. So not only was Easter separated from her mother, she was also separated by her father. And that's the reason why I could not find her. And the other piece is she wasn't born yet. She wasn't born. So I knew I could affix an exact birth year to her because she wasn't on the deed from 1854. She wasn't on the deed the same month that James Trask died in 1855. She wasn't on the inventory, but she was on that quit claim deed in 1856 on Christmas Day. And as the research continued, I began to identify generations going back even further. I still, because there are about 4 Lettys in this plantation community, I'm not sure exactly which one is mine and who her parents are. The Lettys that I have, where I find my Letty is she's like a foundling. It's like the exact same scenario that I have with her daughter. And the thing about it, you all, is on this, remember when I started giving this presentation, I told you my father was raised by his grandparents. This side of my family has a long storied history of other people or grandparents raising grandchildren or community raising children by no circumstances of our own. And so using that 1855 deed, I know that Sago Haynes' parents are Jim Haynes and Maida Palmer. And then I was able to go back an additional generation to Sago Haynes' grandparents, his namesake, Sago, who was born between 1773 and 1785. And I know that he died between 1854 and 1855. They were never on a US census. Maida Palmer was never on a US census. Fatima, who was born between 1775 and 1788, was never on a US census. They were not on the slave schedules. Look at when they passed away, right? Sego, maybe if they calculated his name right, but I know his name. I'm not using a blank line to justify who my folks were. Do you see any of these people with the last name Trask? Do you see any of these people with the last name Ventress? Do you see any of these people with the last name Welch? Using that same thought process of using a blank line and somebody with a surname that sounds or looks like yours is not the appropriate way to research enslaved people. You need more proof and you need to dig a lot harder. Don't dishonor these people by thinking you have a one quick trip, you can make it happen fast, right? And with Sego and Fatima, look at their names, you guys. Look at when they were born. They were born at the founding of this country. This means that my roots on this side go back further than a lot of European dominant folks we know right now. In fact, when I really took inventory of everything, what I found, you all, is going to blow your mind. That number 250 is not arbitrary. There were more than 250 enslaved people who were a part of this population. When I counted all the transactions, I had more than 50 of them. And what I'm talking about deeds, mortgages, powers of attorney, inventories, estates. I had more than 50 different transactions that documented these people between 1805 and 1867. That labor contract was kind of a bookend, right? But it was $24 million in today's money. This is not, oh, I just flung out a dollar value. No, I calculated out all of the money that these people had surrounding this enslaved population, totaled it, and then adjusted it for inflation. And it was more than $24 million. This operation covered 6 states. And notice, right, that we're not just talking about Louisiana and Mississippi, because as I started to dig back further and further in the transactions, I noticed that there were 3 distinct groups of enslaved people, really 4. Right? There was a group that came from Wilkes County, North Carolina, and some of them took the last name Tolliver or Taliaferro, and they were at their earliest ancestors were Randall and Esther, who were born around the exact same time as Sego and Fatima. And then within that same group was Abel and Hannah, and Charles and Clarissa, and Daniel and Molly, right? And that they were purchased by Augustus Welch, who was James Trask's brother, who then sold them to James Trask, who was their owner for an extended period of time. And then James Trask sold them to his nephew. But before they got to the Trask, they were owned by the Middletons. And then before the Middletons, they were owned by the Robinettes, who were in Wilkes County, North Carolina. I know that there's a tie back to Virginia because of the name Tolliver and the fact that Randall and Esther's son Horace lived to see the 1870 census, and they all used the name Tolliver, and he said that he was born in Virginia. So that's where that line stops. Then there's a second group of people who were enslaved at the plantation that was in Natchez, and then they were all shifted down to Wilkinson County, Mississippi, which includes Sego and Fatima, Musa and Katie. Musa's son listed he was born in Africa, and that Katie was born in Africa, along with Bill Chin and Caesar and Clarissa and all these folks. And then there was a third group who was always stayed in Wilkinson County, who were on Percy's Creek with Peter and Sophia and Zuiga and Powello and Coamba and Dick and Charles. And then there was another group who was in New Orleans, where some of those enslaved were executed for being a part of the Louisiana slave revolt. I'm telling y'all, this was a gigantic operation, right? And this is the big house. That's the big house. That's LaGrange Plantation, that was made up of Mount Pleasant Plantation and Prospect Plantation in Wilkinson County. And then if you cross the river and you went over to what they called the River Place, that was Grand Cutoff, right? And I would say luckily, it's probably not luckily for everybody else, but luckily, this sucker burned down. All that are left of the columns out, they rebuilt the house. But in the cemetery, there are some of these early enslaved people. In fact, I really solidly believe that Sago and Fatima and Randall and Esther, all of them are buried there. Because in the papers that I found, now here's the other thing. Remember, I told you this family was in the Northeast. Israel Trask, who's one of the brothers, would split his year between Amherst, Massachusetts, Western Mass, that was full of fugitive enslaved people and free people of color. He would split his year between there and Woodville and New Orleans and send the money back. And in fact, take some of the Trask 250 up there to work in his house. In fact, it's no coincidence that in my Facebook memories this week is the time that I went back last year, a year ago, to that house that is still standing, that he brought some of the Trask 250 to work. And I Facebook lived it. Because his house in Amherst or in Springfield is still standing. When I went there and I talked to the folks at the Historical Society, they didn't know half of what I knew about the Trasks. They didn't even realize that they were slaveholders, had no clue. I walked in that house, I met with the lawyer who operates his business there, and I told him about what I had found. I discovered that Israel Trask was one of the founders of Amherst College, which is a Ivy League institution. He's also a Harvard alumni, which is why his papers ended up at Amherst College and at Harvard, right? So in addition to that, and the family's papers also being at the Mississippi State Archives, which is why I was able to get a picture of the big house, I put all of that information together. And what you're looking at right now are censuses in the 3 different counties. Everyone that you see that is in green is a Trask 250. Everyone. Notice that in Wilkinson County, Mississippi, and in Concordia Parish, Louisiana, the majority of the page is green or yellow. The yellow are my folks, and the green are those folks who were enslaved with them. So this whole notion of looking for the nearest white person, no. You need to be looking for the nearest Black person. Who is in that community with your ancestors in 1870? Who is living around them? It is no coincidence. Search that page. Keep going back to that page, because look at all the Trask 250 are right there. Yes, Shelly, who is your crew? Who are they? Right? Notice that there's not as many people in Point Coupé because it was only a small chunk of folks who were taken there, but the folks who were taken there were the crucial people that I needed, right? Were Sago and his family, okay? And so I look for the nearest Black person. That's all I'm going to say. Alicia says, oh my gosh, my plantation home is a bread and breakfast and I refuse to pay to stay there. Yeah, one of Israel's houses in Springfield is a bed and breakfast now. It is. And I wrote to the people that run it and just basically told them, hey, you know, there's a whole community of people who were enslaved, who their toil and labor finance this. Just so you know what you own, right? Because a lot of times people in the Northeast tend to try to distance themselves from slavery and say, well, we didn't have slavery here, we weren't enslaved. But no, slavery was a system, and people who were in your ancestry probably profited from it. So let's just keep it all the way real. As of today, I have connected more than 300 people to this enslaved community through traditional genealogy and DNA. And I'm not talking flimsy stuff. What I discovered is that this community of people, we all revolve around each other. We are all orbiting each other. If I find an obituary in Baton Rouge for one person, that's going to take me to another 100 people. If you're part of my Patreon community, I have filmed videos where I show you how I'm literally able, based on 9 centimorgans worth of DNA, to trace folks back to all of these people. Okay, it really doesn't take very much because the paper trail and the DNA is there. There are more than 5,000 people who have been traced back to this as a result of me discovering this in my DNA. The database is well over 5,000 people. It's 300 folks that I've been able to connect to it through DNA and genealogy, and it's ironclad. I wish somebody would come and try to say that my receipts weren't tight, because they are. Because these folks, they ended up in locations like Baton Rouge, New Orleans, Chicago. Like, we all end up in the exact same places. And because of, you know, New Orleans and Baton Rouge being so excellent, their papers being so good even early on of publishing obituaries, it makes what I have to do so much easier, right? It makes it just, you know, I literally, if someone new comes in, we literally look at the DNA results, we look at the share matches, we already know how they fit in.